Okay, very good. Good evening, everyone. So, even those who are only slightly familiar with contemporary Hasidim, and certainly with the scene of Hasidus in the United States, is going to be aware of Satmar. Satmar is a Hasidus. It is a Hasidic grouping that is quite given to controversy. When the Satmar Rebbe, we're going to talk about him a great deal, was still, is still in the saddle, as it were. Satmar was always engaged in protest and fights, and speaking out against this cause or that purpose. Satmar was always given to always seemed to be sort of on the cusp of some incredible drama. And what's fascinating about them is that even with all of that, they are remarkably successful. They are the largest Hasidic group possibly in the world, but definitely within the United States, with over 95,000 members confirmed. When we spoke about numbers in the past, like for example, Bubov, we're working with the numbers that are probably inflated. Here, it's probably an underestimate to say that there are 95,000 Satmar Hasidim. They have a large settlement in Williamsburg, which is their headquarters. They have a city in Orange County in New York, Kiryas Yoel, which is just outside of Monroe. They have outposts in New York, elsewhere in New York, in Canada, in Israel, in England, in Belgium, and even Australia. And not only this, but also nobody's controversy, nobody's fight or argument about succession is better known than that about Satmar. And we can even say that Satmar has had a strife from as part of its succession at its very, very founding because the formation of this Hasidic group, Satmar itself, is born of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, a younger son of the Sigeter Rebbe, and we're going to talk about this in greater detail, not finding a place for him in his local court, in his local family in Siget, as we're going to see on the map. And I'm occasionally going to turn to Mel and ask him for a correct pronunciation for some of these place names because, regrettably, I'm not the greatest expert in Hungarian place names, but Mel seems to know them better than I do. Um, but anyways, Yoel founded the Satmar Hasidim as part of a response to a succession crisis within the Sigeter Hasidus. And so let's begin and let's start. So let us start with a list. Now, this is not as nice a list as we've had in the past, and it's not quite as legible for those of you who are present. So I'm just going to sort of read through who these people were until we get to the pertinent names. But the very first name on the very top of the list is a man by the name of Reb Moshe Teitelbaum, and he was born in 1758, passed away in 1841. He was called the Yismach Moshe. He became a chassid after marriage, and he's credited with bringing Chasidus. And just going to turn to the map, just as you can see over here. Now, regrettably, the map is not fantastic for those of you who are present. But if you take a look where I'm pointing with the cursor, this is Galicia, right over here, to the north of Slovakia. He moved from Poland, which was a center of Chasidus, and migrated south to this little location over here called Oyel. He is credited with bringing Hasidus from Galicia, from Poland, to this general region of Transylvania, essentially, of Hungary, Romania, the Carpathian Mountains. This Hasidus did not exist here until this point. He is largely credited with bringing it down. He himself was a student of the famed Hasidic leader, the Jose of Lublin. Um, he took this position and he was known for, amongst other things, involvement in mystical matters, as well as a tenacious opposition to modernizing rather, a culture and acculturating trends which were gradually gaining acceptance amongst the Jews of his day, which meant that he would protest vociferously any change to the order of prayer, the way that Jews presented themselves in terms of their payas, in terms of their clothing, so on and so forth. In 1834, while he's in Oyo, he tries to get his son, and let me go back to our our lineage here. He had a son named Elazar Nisan Teitelbaum. Now, Elazar Nisan Teitelbaum was his son, and he tried. This is Ramosha Teitelbaum tried to get his son appointed as the rabbi of Siget. Now, Siget, let's go back to the map. Siget is right over here in southern Hungary. So he's from all the way from the north to all the way to the south. Now, he was unsuccessful. Rabbi Elazar Nisan was, in a very ungracious way, essentially kicked out of the city. He was encouraged by his father to fight for his position, but instead he actually traveled all the way to the north to Drohobych in the Ukraine, which is right about over here. Drohobych is right about over here, where he became the Rav. He became the rabbi of the community, which is where his in-laws lived. It's where his wife was from. But he did not attempt to establish a Hasidus. He did not attempt to establish himself as a Rebbe. Now, Rabbi Elazar had a son whose name was Yekusiel Yehuda, who was born in 1808, passed away in 1883. He was sent to live in Oil with his grandfather Moshe, who was a major influence in his life. And not only did he model his behavior, his conduct, and his leadership after his grandfather, he ultimately was appointed to the same post as his grandfather because his grandfather, when he passed away, left his position to Yekusiel Yehuda, who became the Rebbe of Oil, as well as the Rav of the city. Now, he was also given to controversy, especially as those who appointed him later lost interest. Because he was a Hasidic Rebbe as well as a Rav, he ran into conflicts because not everybody in the city was a Chassid, and the people who appointed him to this position ultimately decided we would rather just have a city Rav than have a Rebbe here. And that led to conflict. So ultimately, he was, just as his father was kicked out of Siget, was kicked out, went to Drohobych, where his father was the Rav. He inherited that rabbinic position, but ultimately was kicked out of there as well. And then he moves back to Siget, which is again here in the south. And it's only here, finally in 1858, he is appointed as the rabbi of the city. He had taken advantage of political rivalries within the town. Not only that, but he had accrued an incredible amount of goodwill for a eulogy that he gave for a local philanthropist. And ultimately, he became the Rebbe and the Rav of the city of Siget. Now, in Siget, as Yekusiel Yehuda became the Rebbe, he wrote a book. It's his magnum opus. It's called the Yetev Lev. It's a commentary to the Torah. And he, like his forebears, took on some very, very extreme anti-modest positions. He closed the local school that had existed in Siget for 50 years and replaced it with his own Hasidische yeshiva. He attempted, and he was very successful in appointing rabbis, relatives, or people who shared his extremist views all over this area of Hungary along the Carpathians and north, even into Galicia. And his yeshiva also served to be a very strong source of new Hasidim, new adherents, because as he would educate this cadre of young people, they gradually became to see him as a father-like figure, someone who was perhaps someone larger than life, who could guide them, who could give them Jewish principles, and became intimately connected with him. His position, his stature rose with the prominence of his yeshiva, which became very, very large, and it became a way of funneling new adherents to his chasidus in the city of Siget. Now, Lipa also had, he had a son. So this is Yekusiel Yehuda. Yekusiel Yehuda had a son whose name was Hananya Yom Tov Lipa. And he was a city of another town there for about 20 years, but ultimately he was brought to Siget to succeed his father. And he was very, very successful politically. So we're going to just go back to the lineage page. So right now we have Ramosha Teitelbaum, who moves to Hungary. He has a son, Elazar Nisan, who's relatively unsuccessful in Hungary as a Rebbe and goes on to become a Rav in the Ukraine. He himself has a son who's Yekusiel Yehuda, who ultimately is finally successful in the town of Siget and establishes the Siget Hasidus. And this is the Sigeter Hasidim. He is the first Sigeter Rebbe. And he had a son, Hananya Yom Tov Lipa Teitelbaum, who was the second Sigeter Rebbe. Now, he was just as much of an anti-modernist extremist as much as his father, as much as his grandfather, but he was markedly more successful in negotiating politics than his father had been, and as his grandfather had been. So right now we're talking, for example, Hananya Yom Tov Lipa. Hananya Yom Tov Lipa was more successful than his father and his grandfather at negotiating the local politics. And not only this, that even under his watch, there was a breakaway movement within the city of Siget that attempted to leave the established Jewish community infrastructure, create new institutions, and they did this because they felt that that Lipa, as he was known, that Reb Lipa was just too strident, too stringent, and too Hasidish for them. But he was able to successfully bring them back into the broader community. And that again also elevated his status. He showed himself as someone who could really sort of work the system and get things done, yet at the same time not compromise any of his extremist stances. Now, there are reports also that he used thugs to settle his account with his opponents. Essentially, he called the mob. And he even in his commentary that he wrote, he explained, and I'm going to read to you what he said. There are times when even a leader of the Jewish people must show a bit of cruelty as a show of strength. This springs from the quality of mercy, and it is so that he will raise them up and lead them with the might of his hand to the well springs of Torah and good deeds. Now, the yeshiva that Lipa inherited from his father also became one of the largest within Hungary. It had 300 students. And as I've been saying before now, having large yeshivos is a great way of funneling new people into your movement at the same time as that it elevates your own stature. He and his students were dedicated to a relentless fight against modern education. Lipa also opposed and harassed anyone he suspected in taking part in any non-religious or sort of Zionist activity, or even religious Zionist activity. He felt that Zionism in and of itself was an anathema. Regardless of who it was, regardless of their religious persuasion, Zionism itself was a cardinal sin. It was an attempt essentially to force the redemption before the exile had come to its total end. It is an act against God, he argued, because the exile is ordained by God. It is required by God. It is decreed by God, and any action that a person might take to precipitate the end and the reconstitution of a Jewish country with Jews at the head and with Jewish citizens is an act of sacrilege and heresy. He also was very strident in his opposition to any even minor changes of Jewish dress. You always had to wear the same color stockings. You couldn't make any kind of a change. Any kind of change to the kind of hat, the kind of payas that you had, as well as the use of the Yiddish language. He was very opposed to speaking Hungarian. This was because he viewed it as a vehicle for assimilation. And he and his students viewed this strident opposition and this as part of a public persona that they all shared that was a culturally unifying force. Now, firmly ensconced as the Sigeter as he was at the same time also childless. He had one son, but his son died in infancy. So he was lacking for a successor. And as you might recall from many of the classes that we've had where we've been discussing this topic, having a successor is absolutely an essential for any Rebbe worth his medal. So he spoke with the Sanza Rebbe, the Divrei Chaim. And the Divrei Chaim said to him, you know what? Many Jewish leaders were childless. That's just, perhaps just what God ordained for you. Um, That he was not happy with that, and so he asked for a practical solution. And he was told, well, perhaps maybe if you don't have a child after a period of time, maybe you should divorce your wife and maybe marry somebody else and see if you have children with them. And that's exactly what he did. After 20 years of marriage, he divorces his wife, and at age 42, he marries his first cousin, a woman by the name of Hannah Rubinstein, herself a divorcee, and she ultimately did bear Lipa 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters. The oldest son, going back to our lineage page, the oldest son was Chaim Tzvi Teitelbaum, and he was viewed to be the likely successor to Lipa. He was going to be the next Sigeta Rebbe, and that's in fact what happened. And they had a younger son, and the younger son was Reb Yoel, or Yoelish as he was called as a youth. He was himself born in 1887. He was the youngest, and his father was 51 years old when he was born. Now, Yoel, as we're going to be discussing him, was Reb Yoel, ultimately, was judged to have all the qualities of leadership. He shared all of his father's views. He showed intellect as a young student, and he distinguished himself in his Torah studies. He was known to be a brilliant, brilliant student. At age 5, he was able to study Talmud. Yet, from a very early age, he also knew that he would never succeed his father. And this realization led him to, or drove him to distinguish himself all the more. He was doted on by his mother and by his sisters. And at the same time, he also developed an incredible level of piety, a piety remarkable for such a young man. He studied for hours in a separate room. He slept only briefly. He took on regimens of fasting. He grew his payas longer than most. He distributed tzedakah on behalf of the family, and he practiced religious rituals scrupulously, like continuous use of the mikveh, so on and so forth. Now, although during his father's reign, while Lipa was still the Rebbe, he definitely did serve as his father's representative for various community organizations. He acted mostly behind the scenes, and that was not to his liking. He believed that he was no less qualified than his father or his brother to have an actual out front leadership role. And his mother encouraged him. His mother, in fact, went to his father, who was, again, the Sigeta Rebbe, Reb Lipa, and said, well, maybe Tzvi Chaim, or maybe Chaim Tzvi, rather, the older son, should just be made the Dayan of Siget, and Yoel should become the Rebbe. Or at the very least, maybe give him a circuit of communities where he could develop his own following. His father refused. Ultimately, Chaim Tzvi was going to be the next Sigeta Rebbe. So Yoel really grew up in the shadow of his brother, and he knew that if he was going to distinguish himself in public, he would have to leave Siget and do it elsewhere. But before he could do that, he needed to get married. So at age 17, he married his first wife, Chava Horowitz, also a cousin. And again, just showing how much Chaim Tzvi was set to be the heir, to be the next Sigeta Rebbe. The one who was Masader Kedushin, the rabbi who officiated, was not his father. Rather, it was his older brother, Chaim Tzvi, the next Sigeta Rebbe. Immediately after he was wed, he was ordained, and he therefore at that point left to go establish a rabbinate of his own. It was shortly thereafter that the Sigeta Rebbe, Reb Lipa, passed away. His brother Chaim Tzvi took on the leadership of the town, leadership of the Hasidus, as well as the yeshiva. And this was regardless of Yoelish at the time, Reb Yoel's undeniable gifts and his religious piety and the wishes of his mother. So where did he go? He went to the town of Mushayevo. Let's take a look at the map. Mushayevo is right over here. I don't know if you can see my cursor at home. I hope you can. Mushayevo is on the border with the Ukraine now. This wasn't the border with the Ukraine, but this was Mushayevo, and this was the first position that he had. Now, this was a tiny little place, and he had absolutely no interest in this position. He wanted a pulpit, and he wanted a location that would be at least as prominent as his brother's or his father's. Now, the reason why he took this position was to entirely avoid the draft. But he was, as mentioned, he was unenthusiastic about this, and he basically kept his home in Siget. Perhaps he would go there every once in a while. So his mother went to the Marienbad Spa, which was a common place for all the Rebbes to gather for vacation or for holiday. And she ran into the Belzer Rebbe and she asked the Belzer Rebbe, "What should I do with my son? My son needs a legitimate position. He is brilliant, as every mother believes. He is set to become a Rebbe, a powerhouse within the Yiddish Welt. He needs to go somewhere, and this tiny little place is not for him. He needs something somewhere more prominent." So the Belzer Rebbe suggested Satmar. Where is Satmar? Satmar is right over here. It's Satu Mare, I believe it's called in Hungarian. In Yiddish, it's Satmar. Now, the official town Rav of Satmar, which is a rather large community, was a man by the name of Yehuda Grunwald, who also happened to be at the spa at the same time. And he agreed. He said, "Yeah, Rabbi Yoel should come to Satmar. It will not be Hasagas Gvul. It won't be an incursion into somebody else's territory. I don't view him as undermining my authority." And this is now me speaking. He shared many of the same anti-modernist attitudes that the Teitelbaum family shared, and he thought that perhaps with Rabbi Yoel there, Rabbi Yoel would rally the Hasidim to support him, and he probably would have been correct, except that after Rabbi Yoel moved there, he found that the number of Hasidim who were local was rather small, and not only that, but he wasn't the only Hasidic young man from a Rebbeische family attempting to establish his own court. There were four others locally, and they did not take kindly to the scion of the Segeter Rebistova coming into their midst. And so he had a lot of opposition locally. He had no official position in Satmar. Once he became a resident, he began gathering as many people as he could, but it was not enough for him to make a living. And it certainly wasn't enough to rival what his brother had in Siget. And that's ultimately really what he wanted. So if he was going to succeed, he had to do more. And as mentioned earlier, there weren't enough people. He did not have enough followers to sustain him financially. And now he had two daughters. So in 1911, I'm still looking for work. He was elected as rabbi of the pound of Orsova or Shiva, which is right about over here in the Ukraine. It's now called something else, called Ir Shuva or something of the sort in the Ukraine. It's called something else. It took me a long time to find it, but it's right about over here. Now, this was not a great place, and he was not entirely happy there. The reason why is because this was not a location that had a lot of Hasidim. There were a lot of Jews, but not a lot of Hasidim. And the Hasidim who were there already had Rebbes. All of the surrounding areas had Rebbes. So what does he do? Well, with a lot of audacity, he attempts to poach Hasidim from the local Rebbes. He was scrupulously pious and religious and observant, as we mentioned earlier. And here he also ran into a great deal of trouble because he challenged the establishment. He felt that as his role as the community rabbi, he needed to impose his kashrus standards on the locals, and he decreed all of the local meat treif. Now, in these tiny little towns, the people who were best fed, if not the wealthiest, were tended to be the butchers, which meant that the local people, the people with the largest amount of capital and definitely the largest amount of food, were now quite opposed to him. Not only did he have the challenge of local strife, but he also didn't speak the vernacular very well. Again, he's right now in a location that spoke Hungarian, Romanian, Ukrainian, whatever the case may be. This was the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. He mostly spoke Yiddish. And the state authorities were necessary in order to formally approve elected rabbis generally required that the rabbis speak the local language, at least in a passable way. But ultimately, despite all the challenges, he did get the appointment. And in the process, he actually did learn how to handle the politics of controversy, and marshal supporters on his behalf. And with a lot of audacity, he had a measure of success. He was able to establish a yeshiva there. He gained a following. His institution was substantial. It wasn't the largest, but it definitely was a start. And he was able to train as well as attract to him people who kept his hard line point of view. And he was even successful in appointing some of them into positions of authority around him in some of the local, in some of the surrounding areas, some of his administration, the Av Beis Din, for example. Not only that, but also around this time, the First World War is about to break out, and Jews are sort of moving around to escape the front, to escape war. And there's a large influx of Jews who came to this location, elevating his status. So as people were exposed to him, and he gained reputation as a leader of note, his star essentially began to rise at this point. Now, with the Great War, with World War I, the borders began to shift, and the Austro-Hungarians citizens found themselves living in a whole bunch of different countries. And so now he was, by this time, but at the beginning of the war, he had moved to he moved back to Satmar, which he had left because he couldn't make a living there. But he went there because he felt it would probably be safer. So he was in Romania. Meanwhile, Orsheva was actually in, at that point, what was Czechoslovakia, and crossing the border became increasingly challenged. So he was cut off from his post, and he was cut off from his post, and he needed to make a living, and he was living in Satmar. So what does he do? Well, he applies to be the rabbi of Satmar. I guess the previous rabbi had passed away, and now there was an opening, and so he applied. Now, there was a great deal of opposition to his candidacy, and was fueled by a motley crew of a coalition. There were the there were the sort of the non-Hasidim who felt that having a Rebbe who was a Chassid, or having a Rav who was a Chassid would probably not work all that well for himself, for themselves. He was also he was a zealot. And so therefore, the people who are perhaps less given to that were uncertain that was necessarily for them as well. The Hasidim didn't necessarily want him because they were afraid that his prominence would poach their Hasidim to him. The religious Zionists didn't want it because he was just so stridently and incredibly opposed to Zionism, that it just was probably going to be somewhat problematic. So the religious council of the city rejected his candidacy. It was about this time that one of his daughters also passed away due to scarlet fever. So although he didn't receive the official position in Satmar, some Hasidim who had broken with the official Jewish community there were impressed by his outspokenness and began to see Rabbi Yoel as their leader, and they began supporting him privately. Some of them even claimed that he was the sole religious authority and religious leader for their group. And gradually he became the first choice for the more extremist groups within the town who saw him as their rabbi. Now, while he was in Satmar, he definitely appreciated the accolades and the respect that he was given. Accolades and respect don't feed your family, don't feed children. And he definitely needed a actual position in order to bring home money to feed the family. So he returns to Orsheva, and he did manage as a rabbinic authority and as a district rabbi. And while he was there, he also gained greater experience at negotiating politics. And he was markedly successful while he was in Orsheva. It was also in 1924, while he was there, and he had returned in 1922. In 1924, just before Rosh Hashanah, he married off his oldest daughter, Roisela, at a ceremony that was also officiated by his brother, the Sigeta Rebbe. Now, he was not content to remain in Orsheva. Orsheva was very much a third or fourth tier town. And finally, a position became available just outside of Satmar. So if you go over here to Satu Mare, there's a little town over here called Cariol, or something of the sort, Carrier, which is a town here in Romania. In Yiddish, it's called Krula. And he became the Krula Rav. And in fact, that's something that he would be known for the rest of his life. The outgoing Rav was a good friend of his, a man by the name of Reb Shmuel Brach. He was a family friend. He was leaving. He took a position elsewhere, and he recommended Reb Yoel to be his replacement. And although he was unenthusiastic about it, he did take the job because there was a great deal of influence from the well-to-do Jews of the town who tipped the vote in his favor. So in 1926, he relocated his yeshiva from Orshiva to Krula and became a Rav and became a Rebbe there, and he expanded his yeshiva. His yeshiva, not only did he take his students from the north with him to the south, he also was able to recruit from the locals and attract people from farther abroad as well. Now, what he was very unhappy there, and he was unhappy for a very specific reason. He was unhappy because that very same real year that he arrived in 1926, his brother passed away. Now, he was a Hasidic Rebbe in his own right. He was a Rav. He had a lot of experience. He had a lot of success. And not only that, but he also maintained the same strident, outspoken, zealous, anti-modernist positions that the rest of his family did. So he was a natural choice to succeed his brother. But there was only one problem, and that was the Rebbitzin. His brother's widow realized that should Yoel come, all of the authority and all of the power that she had in the court would be lost with Yoel and his family. Not only that, but the Gaboyim also, because his brother was a little bit of a weak character, not a ton of charisma, also allowed them to accrue a lot of authority and power within the court, also were loath to lose that authority should Yoel come, who was had a much stronger personality and would also likely appoint his own people into those positions. So this, another motley crew, another coalition formed, and they just determined that the 14-year-old son of Chaim, a young man, 14 years old again, by the name of Zalman Leib, would be appointed as the new Rebbe. That the fact that this undistinguished, unmarried youngster was preferred over his uncle was very, very offensive to him, and it also highlights a truth about succession. That is that when it comes to succession, familial, social, economic, and political concerns trump almost everything else. Dissatisfied with Krula, Yoel campaigned for positions in a number of places that he visited, and also raised his own star by becoming a mentor to his nephew in Siget. He actually even married his daughter to his nephew, Zalman Leib. Zalman Leib became his nephew, and he himself officiated at the chasana. Now, when the standing Rav of Satmar passed away in the spring of 1928, there was a vacancy, and Rabbi Yoel applied for this position. Now, this was a plum position. Satmar had 15,000 to 20,000 Jews at the time, so this meant that it had a significant population. That meant also a higher income for Rabbi Yoel. It was also a more noteworthy position. And the idea of him being a Rebbe and a Rav, which is what he had done until this point, always appealed to him because that's what his father had done, that's what his great-grandfather had done, that's what his grandfather had done. That was just part of what the Teitelbaums did. So he applied for the position, and he won a plurality of the votes. However, he was met with a powerful opposition who claimed that the selection was fraudulent. So it went to a Beis Din, and a Beis Din determined that a new election should be had. So there was a second election, and it was even more one-sided in his favor. At this point, in 1928, he received a formal letter of appointment to be the community Rav of the city of Satmar. However, there was still a lot of local opposition who lobbied the local civil authorities, the secular authorities, as well as took him to yet another Beis Din, and there was a third election. It was at this point that he actually finally lost. Feeling disenfranchised, this quarrel went on for years. He moved in 1934 finally to Satmar, not to become the Rebbe, not to become the Rav of the city, but rather to become, just a Rebbe and not occupy an official rabbinic position within the city, but to be the Rav for the Hasidic contingent within the community. But because he still viewed himself as the rightful rabbi of the city, he at least once a month would attend the local non-Hasidic shul. Now, he had a lot of authority here. He relocated his yeshiva, for example, and he had 350 students. It was the largest in Transylvania. It was the largest institution. And that meant that he brought with him a lot of clout, a lot of numbers, and he attracted many, many followers. He, through his institutions, provided employment for his followers. Now, because he also wanted to make his brand of scrupulous religious observance more attractive, he also worked and negotiated to bring the cost and price down for example, of his meat that met his special standards, which was very popular with his followers. Um, and again, because of his strident approach, he attracted a great number of people. And he also advocated that his Hasidim not be Torah scholars, not be people who studied Torah all day, but rather go out and get trades. Also meant that that while his community was by no means wealthy, they were probably in a better financial position than most other groups at the time. And that earned him a lot of praise, a lot of accolades. And again, his star was really on the rise. Gradually, the Satmar Rebbe, as he became known at this point, began overshadowing his nephew in Siget. And many Hasidim who had viewed themselves as Sigeter Hasidim until this point now started viewing themselves as Satmar Hasidim because he was a much more charismatic, a much more competent, a much more successful fellow than this young man who had taken over the Rebbe's position in the South. So he emerged as a young man who couldn't find a place for himself or whose father wouldn't make any room for him in the locale where he was. He went on a bit of a migration to find a place for himself, ultimately landing in Satmar and elevated himself to a position greater than that of his nephew. And his Rabistava, his court was greater than the one that he initially wanted to inherit. Now, while he was having all of this success, his personal life was actually suffering. His daughter, who married the Siget Rebbe, passed away. And he already lost another daughter, if you recall, died due to a bout of the scarlet fever. He had only one daughter who survived, and that was Roisela. Now, losing two children was catastrophic to his wife, and her health deteriorated. And by 1936, she too also died. So he was left only with his daughter. So just 4 months later, after his wife passes away, he asks his daughter to please help him find a shidduch. And less than within the year, he was married again to a woman by the name of Fega Shapiro, who was the orphaned and never married daughter of Poland's Częstochower Rebbe, and she was only half his age. He was 41 years old at the time that he married her. Now, at the time of his second marriage, Roisela was older than his second wife. And she, until this point, very much acted as the Rebbitzin. And with this new woman coming into the court, there was a great deal of strife. Stepdaughter and stepmother did not get along. And the stepmother, Fega, made a concerted attempt to keep Roisela away from her husband. In her mind, there was only room for one woman in the life of the Satmar Rebbe, and that was going to be her. Neither woman would have children, and this was a matter that really troubled Yoel, and Roisela ultimately became estranged from her husband. Now, Roisela is the daughter. Fega is his wife. Yeah, she was married, but she would never have any children. She now I was all throughout Rabbi Yoel's life, he was encouraged by his Hasidim and encouraged by relatives to, I'm just going to go back to the lineage page, to divorce his wife and remarry. He never did, but going back to the marriage, over here, if you recall, Yekusiel Yehuda, Yekusiel Yehuda is the nephew of Rabbi Teitelbaum, who was the Rebbe of Siget, who became the Rebbe when he was 14 years old. He had a younger brother, Moshe. Now, Yekusiel Yehuda Teitelbaum did not survive the Second World War, but Moshe did. Moshe became the Sigeter Rebbe. He was Rabbi Yoel's nephew. Again, he was the younger nephew. Now, Moshe was one of those people who had encouraged the Satmar Rebbe to divorce Fega and marry somebody else, maybe have some children. Now, this poisoned Moshe's relationship to Fega. There was in the feud between Fega and Roisela, Moshe had remained loyal to his cousin. And this was a fact that the new Rebbitzin would never forgive. And this comes up as we're going to see later on. She accused him of wanting her out so that he could claim the throne of Satmar for himself. But Moshe was one of those people who had actively encouraged the Rabbi Yoel to divorce his wife, and this really created a lot of friction within the family because Fega was an incredibly powerful, a very strong person, a strong-willed individual, and this was something that she would never forgive. And this will come back to bite them later on when Rabbi Yoel passes away in decades later in North America. Now, there was a lot of intensification of anti-Jewish activity that led up to the outbreak of the Second World War before the German invasion of Poland. But the Jews of Hungary, and let me go back to the map, were largely, I'll take a look at this picture. Were largely, were largely, we're largely insulated from this, but I actually would like to talk about these pictures here. So all the way on the left, that's Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum as a young man. That's him as a young man. That's him when he was obviously older, the middle picture. On the right is actually a picture of the king of Romania who made a stop in Satmar. And the first person he greets when he gets off the train among the dignitaries is the Satmar Rebbe. And this elevated the Satmar Rebbe's prestige in the eyes of his Hasidim, Jews world over. This was this King Carol II, I think his name was. He's the king of Romania. And he's, yeah, and you can see him over there. He's greeting, he's shaking the hand of the Satmar Rebbe. Again, the Satmar Rebbe was the first person that he walked over to greet. That's how important the Satmar Rebbe was viewed in the eyes of the civil authorities as well at this time. So it's actually really, really interesting, really fascinating picture. It's immortalized. This is a very, very famous, very well-known picture. And the caption reads at the bottom that King Carol II is greeting the Satmar Rebbe. Anywho, so the Jews of Hungary are largely insulated from what was going on during the beginning of the Second World War. However, the Germans occupied Hungary in 1944, and it was at that point that the situation for the Jews in Hungary got just as bad as they had been for the Jews of just about everywhere else. So what was Rabbi Yoel doing in the lead up to 1944? Well, he traveled to many Jewish communities. He built up and solidified his influence. He stressed the need for insularity from modern secular life. He passed bans on attending the theater, reading the newspaper, as well as other forms of secular literature. And that was his priority. That's what he spent most of his time talking about, and that's what he focused on. He also continued his battle against Zionism and its supporters. In 1939, he asserted that those who immigrated to the land of Israel through the Zionists are grabbing onto a flame of fire. And he also discouraged immigration to the United States. In the spring of 1944, as the Jews of Transylvania were finally now being herded into ghettos, and as rumor reached Rabbi Yoel that the Nazis were searching for him, he assented to an alternate plan to flee towards Romania, where King Carol II, who was still the reigning monarch, was fighting tooth and nail to protect his local Jewish subjects. And so he wrapped himself up in a handkerchief to hide his beard, hide his payas, got into a Red Cross ambulance, and made his way to Cluj. Now, Jews will know Cluj by a different name. We call it Klausenburg, but Cluj is what it's called in Romania, and was still at this point within Hungary. It was at this point, however, that he was caught. He was about 30 miles from the Romanian border, and he was sent. He was sort of locked up in the Klausenburg ghetto. The Zionist agency around this time was engaged in negotiations with Adolf Eichmann to allow a trainload of Jews to receive safe passage all the way to Switzerland. And he knew that he would have a very difficult time convincing the Zionists to allow him onto this train. But you know what works? Bribes. And so he bribed his way to get himself and many of his followers onto this train. And it's actually, we have to take back step back. While he was still in Satmar, he realized that things were getting really, really bad. And so in 1943, he sent Roisele to Budapest to get certificates for himself, her, and their families um, into Israel. But he needed to get the assent of the Zion of the quote unquote Zionist Jewish agency. And they would only give him the papers if he was prepared to sign a document recognizing the Zionist organization's authority. And he refused to do that. So he's now in Cluj, and his family pays a bribe, and he's able to get himself onto a train that ultimately took him to Switzerland. So on May the 3rd, 1944, the Rebbe, his wife, along with his Gabbai, and several others were spirited out of the Cluj or the Klausenberg ghetto and boarded a train that would ultimately, over the course of about a year or two, make its way to Switzerland, which he finally did on the 21st of Kislev, which is a Satmar Day of Thanksgiving until now. They celebrate it as a bit of a celebratory day. Now you have to ignore the contradiction that he made use of. He condemned Zionism, but he made use of a train that they had organized to get him out. Um, he was to his Hasidim. They didn't ask whether or not that was a contradiction. To them, it was viewed as a sign from heaven that their Rebbe was assigned or was subject to special considerations. Now, as the war ended, um, Jews returned to Transylvania and to Satmar, and several thousand did return. They reestablished schools, the Chevra Kadisha, even a Beis Din, and the Hasidim returned also, and they tried to get their Rebbe to return with them to to Satmar while he was in Switzerland. He couldn't remain in Switzerland. The Swiss were basically telling him that he had to leave. So where does he go? He makes his way to that what was then Palestine. Now, again, he needed to get papers from the Zionist agencies, and they refused to do so. But he was subject to some bit of divine providence in that the British granted granted visas to all of the passengers of that train, regardless of who they were. So whether or not the Zionist agencies were pro or against, the British gave him the papers that he needed. And in 1945, he made his way to Haifa. He settled in Yerushalayim and attempted to establish a small yeshiva there in Mea She'arim. But he wasn't particularly successful. The yeshiva was very small, and his Hasidim had mostly been killed, and the ones who survived did not go to Israel. Did not go to Israel. And so, about a year later, 1946, he goes to the United States, ostensibly to fundraise for his yeshiva, but he never returned, and he remained there to become the Rebbe of the Satmar Hasidim in New York. Now, his start in the United States was rather modest. His first residence was a borrowed home in Crown Heights. When he wanted to daven with a minyan, he had to go out into the street and start grabbing passersby to summon them for davening. It definitely was not. It gave no. There was no indication that he was going to establish what would become the largest Hasidic court in the United States. That only began when he moved shortly thereafter to Williamsburg. Now, his survival he attributed to the intervention of God in religious Jews, and he also stated that the Zionists had no part in it. On the contrary, he argued that the Zionists themselves determined the number of permissions, and the English authorities issued them according to their dictates, and they only granted them to those who abided by the approaches of Zionism, its sacrilege, quote unquote, and its heresy. And he also justified his post-Holocaust theology that Zionism was the original sin which resulted in the destruction of European Jewry. The Holocaust happened because of Zionism, at least according to him. Now, but in the United States, so now he has to work to reestablish his court. He, in the United States, felt that contemporary culture, no less than anti-Semitism and modern Zionism, could terminate Jewry by swallowing up the Jews and making them act like Gentiles, or as he would call them, Goyim. So the Rebbe would fight against Jews acting even in the most minor ways like the people around them. He endorsed a passive resistance and cultural insulation as a strategy for his success. So the community that he built in Brooklyn, which started in the late 1940s in Williamsburg along Bedford Avenue, here his view dominated. Rabbi Yoel was the magnet that drew and held his Hasidim there in order to remain close to the Rebbe and the institutions that began to shape their lives. The challenge of building a growing community and still remaining insulated from modern life in an urban neighborhood so close to, the center of New York was quite daunting. I'm going to use, you can't at home see my quotation marks over here, but the proximity of cultural pollution could also be the source of incredible amount of strength because it was a culture war that the Satmar community engaged in that it made them feel that what they were fighting was immediate and unrelenting, and therefore they were inspired daily. He would often quote the Belzer Rebbe, who said that if you live in a community that has no wicked Jews, it might be worthwhile to pay some wicked Jews to move there so you have somebody to separate yourself from. I'm going to also quote the Satmar Rebbe here. The very act of declaring separateness from the wicked strengthens the commitment of righteousness. So in his enclave, he did not build many shuls. He felt that that was the mistake of previous immigrants. Instead, he built schools. He built elementary schools. He built yeshivos. He built girls' schools. He built summer camps. In Satmar, the idea of secular education, even though it was mandated by American law, was a dangerous tool of acculturation, and therefore it would only be offered at the most minimum of levels. And this effort to graft this European past onto the American present, he justified by claiming that Yiddishkeit does not grow from compromises. The Satmar Rebbe stressed the need to be publicly and uncompromisingly Hasidish. He emphasized the need to dress and look distinctive. And this was actually quite countercultural because this was in the 1950s when the melting pot ideal in the United States was the prominent view. The struggle to remain apart as well as distinctive and to argue these positions were the only way to remain authentically Jewish and ensure survival made Yoel and his followers feel that they were part of a great cause and were true defenders of Yiddishkeit. And this also meant that in essence, he was diametrically opposed to outreach. His Hasidim often fought with Lubavitch, who incorporated the exact opposite approach of conducting outreach. He believed that by bringing outsiders near was the recipe for making insiders become distant from Judaism. He grew his community through inreach, through encouraging early marriage and large families, and shaping the young in his schools and branding them with an uncompromising stance as the only way, as the essential recipe to ensure the Satmar survived into the modern world. In 1948, Rabbi Yoel set up a community infrastructure and an administration called the Yetev Lev, which set up a set of regulations that would mark Satmar and it would be a template for the rules that governed their society. Effectively, he put himself in the position of primal authority, and everything was carried out according to his will. This included the Satmar institutions like schools, which he opened up almost immediately, to butcher shops, which were now certified under his own hashgacha that accorded or that conformed to a higher level of kosher standards. He had his own matzah bakery that was claimed to be more kosher than all the others. In 1956, he established a summer camp in the Catskill Mountains. He maintained totally controlled environments. As his Hasidus grew and as there became greater conflict with the people around him, he recognized the need to establish a enclave outside of New York so that he could grow his Hasidic group outside of the reach of the American social milieu. And that was the catalyst for the formation of Kiryas Yoel, which was a town that was incorporated in 1977 just outside of Monroe in New York's Orange County. Here, he established a virtual kingdom where his rules were law and could be developed according to his dictates. And it was there that he was prepared to move. However, by the time Kiryas Yoel was established, Yoel was no longer himself. He had recently suffered a stroke, and unconscious for 10 days. He finally woke up to find himself with a broken body. He was severely impaired. His speech and movement were very, very, were very difficult, and questions of succession rose again. He, see, he largely became largely segregated from his Hasidim at this point. Um, Meanwhile, Fega, his wife, and the Gaboyim took over control of the day-to-day administration of Satmar. Not only that, but his nephew, if you recall, he had a nephew, Moshe Teitelbaum, who survived the war and became the Sigeta Rebbe, was also quietly taking a greater role in the court. Now, during his decline, Moshe was increasingly being brought into Williamsburg and into the presence of the Rebbe, and it seemed like he was being primed as the candidate who would succeed him. However, this would only be done over the objections of Fega and many of the Gaboyim. Fega, had tacit control over the Gaboyim, and the Gaboyim knew that they would likely be replaced should Moshe ascend to become the Rebbe. Now, she also had her own force of personality and a long history with the Hasidim. She had a high profile as a fundraiser for charities. And she was pretty certain that many Hasidim would support her in a leadership position after her husband would pass away. And as hard as she could, Fega worked to build up credit and authority. She used the 10 years of her husband's illness dedicated for this purpose. She distributed funds. She did favors. She made alliances. She generally acted as a powerful stand-in for her ailing husband, even sometimes speaking from the lectern and taking pidyonos, donations, and delivering blessings from her husband. But of course, she could never fear Tish. She couldn't run a Hasidic table. And should the Rebbes ever gather, she could never be counted among them with the very strict gender segregation that exists within the Hasidic communities. And she knew that she knew that she had a disadvantage, but she had a plan. She viewed that her husband was larger than life and would be viewed as such by his Hasidim. And so therefore she tried to argue that there should be no successor to Moshe to Yoel when he passes away. And the community should be governed by a Rav, by a Dayan, with ultimate control, the levers of authority being held by her and the Gaboyim. This would be the vision of Satmar that she had. Again, she was strongly opposed to Moshe succeeding her husband, as she bore that grudge against Moshe for having advocated that Yoel divorce her. And she also wanted to maintain that authority, control, and power. But that wouldn't pass muster. The Hasidim, especially the younger ones, wanted a full-fledged Rebbe, not a powerful Rebbitzin. And not only this, but many of the Hasidim were concerned that should Rabbi Yoel pass away, many of the Hasidim would leave Satmar and go to the Sigeta Rebbe, because anyways, they were mishpacha, they were family. Satmar was a offshoot of Siget anyways. So in the summer of 1979, after Rabbi Yoel passed away, Rav Moshe was ordained as the successor. Now, he had a lot of controversy. He was not as powerful a personality as his uncle had been. And not only this, but disputes over succession lingered for years. Leaflets were distributed just before he was ordained as the Rebbe with an unflattering picture of Moshe, with the words printed, "Is this the man who is worthy of inheriting the place of our holy Rebbe?" Moshe appeared to many Hasidim to be painfully inferior to his uncle. And even as the inevitability of a succession seemed to be a foregone conclusion, many people, Fega, and a group of adherents to Yoel, called the Bnei Yoel, coalesced as an opposition. But despite all of this, again, he did become the Rebbe, and he was ordained as, or maybe not ordained is the right word, but he was crowned as the second Satmar Rebbe. So let's take a look at a picture of Moshe, because this is Moshe all the way here on the left. That is him. Now, Moshe moved quickly to take possession of the crown and assure Satmar's future. By afternoon following his coronation, the announcement was made that Moshe's oldest son, Aharon, the man in the middle there, was to be appointed the head of the yeshiva in Kiryas Yoel. Other sons were appointed in other locations. The youngest, Zalman Leib, on the right there, was was appointed to a position in Brooklyn, a very, very minor and insignificant position. At Aaron's behest, the middle son, who was deemed to be the likely heir and the next Satmar Rebbe, the youngest son, Lipa, as he was called, was even junted further away and sent off to Israel. Now, in Israel, Satmar is not a force. It's essentially it doesn't exist there. This was essentially an exile. And this was a brother acting against brother, exiling him to remove any potential competition for the succession of the Hasidus. Within a very short time of Moshe becoming the Satmar Rebbe, he was effectively in control. He signed directives about how his Hasidim should vote in the oncoming primary for state assembly, and the succession seemed complete. His sons and sons-in-law were all situated in positions of authority in the Satmar Empire. In 1984, which is about 4 years later, Aaron's profile himself begins to rise. Now, Aaron is the man in the middle. He's the oldest son. A group of people from Kiryas Yoel approach the Rebbe and say to him, we want Aaron to become the Mora d'Asra of all of Kiryas Yoel. So we want him to be the most senior official, essentially being the Rebbe for Kiryas Yoel, with being the Rebbe in all but name. And he was appointed to that role, to that position. And he was proclaimed as the heir, the successor to Moshe when Moshe would pass away. Moshe himself had many tests to his authority, and he had to marshal his abilities as a leader, and he had to beat back many, many challenges. His authority became recognized nearly by everyone as time went on. Again, he had a far lower profile than his predecessor. His charisma flowed from the fact that he was Rabbi Yoel's nephew and the fact that he was a Teitelbaum of the Holocaust generation. But his power and his prestige did grow. In 1984, for example, he convinced the government to officially designate his Hasidim as a disadvantaged minority, making them eligible for a wider array of economic and welfare benefits that effectively helped subsidize Satmar. In fact, the Satmar yeshivas received food from the government, and that was a boon. He was a Rebbe who could provide for his flock. He was generally described as self-effacing and humble. He had a personality that contrasted quite strongly with his strident, fiery uncle. He created at the same time, however, conditions that allowed Satmar to grow to an unprecedented size. Yoel became the subject of hallowed memory. A birth of new generations of Hasidim who had never known him grew up, and the only Rebbe they ever knew was Moshe. Now, Moshe wasn't the strident fighter that his uncle had been, but he was able to show authority, lead, and provide for his community. Now, while he could fight back the opposition, and the opposition was primarily in the form of Fega, and she largely was a thorn in his side, and he was ultimately able to sidestep her, to leave her somewhat without authority and power, but he couldn't fight back time. And eventually, and he was 65 years old when he became the Rebbe, and he wasn't getting any younger. But now that Satmar was growing, many of the Hasidim began complaining. Now the fights were all gone. They weren't fighting the same way they were before. Fights invigorated the community. It was at the foundation of Satmar, but that wasn't who Moshe was. The fight was missing. Even in his trademark war against Zionism, which was so ingrained and so associated with Satmar, it seemed muted. And with the Rebbe's health and decline, that fighting energy within Satmar also seemed to diminish. So unsurprisingly, increased attention began being paid to his son, Aaron, who is the likely heir. And speculation began to grow over what kind of a reign he would have. Now, like many crown princes, he had, to quote unquote, an especially high evaluation of power and often acted as though he were a full-fledged Rebbe. And apparently his father didn't object, at least not at first. In 1996, he had a kidney transplant. I mean, Moshe did, the father. And he called all of his sons together and reiterated to all of them that when he dies, his son is to take over the court. It was nearly a bridge between his potent uncle and his worthy successor. But Aaron himself was a subject to criticism. People were unhappy of his treatment of Fega. And many people who were unable to target the Rebbe because the Rebbe had too much prestige and too much power, they turned their criticisms to Aaron. He was viewed as they spread the opinion that he led the village Kiryas Yoel in a high-handed manner. They labeled him a usurper who exerted power that wasn't his. He had an imperious reputation. He was married to a Zionist sympathizer. I believe he was married to. I'm trying to remember the Hasidus that he married into. Let me see if I can find it. Come on. Um, he oh he was married. He married the Vishnitzer Rebbe's children. He married the Vishnitzer Rebbe's daughter, rather. His daughter went to Beis Yaakov. Not from enough. She spoke Hebrew, where the instruction was not in Yiddish, it was in Hebrew. He was practically a Zionist. And therefore, he just was not worthy to lead Satmar. Now, in 1996, after the kidney transplant, Moshe's weakness was increasing, and he was also developing dementia. In 1999, while that was going on, some of his Gaboyim um, convinced him that he could no longer manage the community himself, which had grown by this point. Some estimates were up to 120,000 people. And even for a young, dynamic, vigorous Rebbe, that would have been a daunting prospect. And here you have this sick, elderly Rebbe. So they told the Rebbe, you need help. You need an assistant, someone who can act as your representative and do your job. But these Gaboyim here were themselves concerned that should Aaron be the one to be brought in, that means that when he should ascend to a position of authority, he will replace all of them with his own administration that he had in Kiryas Yoel. So they brought in the exiled son from Israel, Zalman back. I'm sorry, it wasn't Lipa. Lipa was another brother. They brought Zalman back, Zalman Leib back to be the Rebbe's representative right-hand man and act as the Rebbe's designate in Williamsburg. Now, Zalman was not in line for this position. As mentioned, he was in exile. He was kind of like the Yoel of his day. So because of that, he didn't develop imperious ways. He was much more personable than Aaron. And also, the Gabayim argued, or probably justified themselves, should he be in a position of authority, he owes them, he's not going to replace them. So Zalman was brought back, and with a great deal of joy, at least as reported in the Williamsburg press, as well as shock and anger by Aaron and his group, he was elevated to a position that was possibly even above Aaron's in the hierarchy within the family. However, Aaron's family did not, again, Satmar was given the conflict and they fought. So Aaron had his own supporters in Williamsburg, and they perpetrated what was called apple cider night. What was apple cider night? Well, some of Aaron's supporters in Williamsburg replaced all of the Rebbe's wine with apple cider on Pesach night. So as he was conducting a Seder, he was pouring bottles and wine did not come out. Rather, apple cider did. This was a dirty trick that was meant to signal that they would fight any effort to dethrone Aaron as the heir. Now, the psychologist Henry Abramovich writes, he says that when an older sibling perceives a younger sibling as having displaced him, there's a deep sense of wounding that often leaves a lasting sense of injustice, leading to the older child to feel surrounded by enemies and rivals. And here in our case, the more popular Zalman became, the more resentful Aaron and his Hasidim became. Now, Zalman is the guy all the way on the right. Now, for those who opposed Aharon, Zalman presented a happy alternative. Even those people who rejected the father Moshe found ways to support Zalman joining his clique, and he found ways to accept them back, despite the fact that they had acted to delegitimize his father. And it was a difficult transition. Most Hasidim had been encouraged and to believe that Aaron was the likely successor for over a decade. Now they had to think that Zalman is now perhaps the next person to take over the Hasidus. And so this was a market, this was like just a new world for these people. Slights to Aaron now occurred more publicly in Williamsburg, which fast became Zalman's territory. In 2000, in Williamsburg, Aaron came with his grandson to celebrate his grandson's bar mitzvah, the first bar mitzvah of Moshe's great grandchildren, but he was denied an aliyah, and a fight broke out. This was a slight to Aaron, and this was done in the presence of Moshe, the great grandfather of the boy. So Satmar began splitting into two groups, the Aronis and the Zalis. The Aronis supported Aaron and the Zalis supported Zalman. The Aronis struck back, and their response to Aaron's rejection and humiliation included physical and verbal violence. But for their part, the Zalis, Zalman's Hasidim, claimed that Aaron had brought this all upon himself because he used these family gatherings as for political gains and to assert his control. If he was going to use these events as political opportunities, then it was only right that those who challenged him would be willing and prepared to fight back. The energy of conflict was back in Satmar, and the Hasidim were now charged up by it. This time, however, it wasn't directed outwards, it was directed inwards. The competition between these two sons, while being confusing and adding to tension, injected an energy of contest that Satmar had been lacking for a while. And as the opposition between the groups hardened and toughened them, each person took a side. The Aronis and the Zalis engaged in an internal war, and this often took the form of litigation in the New York courts, where there were fights over property, especially if they were of symbolic importance. As the battle between the brothers intensified in the closing years of Moshe's life, one of the factions even petitioned the court to have the aging Rebbe, Moshe, declared incapacitated and to have co-guardians appointed for his personal needs and property management. They tried to get Moshe out of the way so that they could fight each other by declaring him mentally inept, incapable of taking care of himself. So Ramosha, at a public gathering with Aaron, basically said, I know what you're doing. You're a Russia ben Russia. You're a wicked man, the son of a wicked man, which is a funny thing for him to say. You think I'm kalaching, you think I'm deranged. I have enough sense to know what you are trying to do. Now, this effort was fought vigorously by the Gaboyim and by Zalman. They're fighting each other tooth and nail. The dispute galvanized both sides, even as it clearly diminished the Rebbe's honor and stature. How could a Rebbe who could be declared incompetent be looked on as a holy intermediary between the Chassid and Hashem? Some looking in from the outside saw this as a particularly low point for Satmar. Now, the end came in 2006 when Moshe finally passed away, and then the succession battle really began in earnest, and it really tarnished both sides. At the end, as one reporter noted, not even sitting Shiva has muted the war. Instead, the immediate concern was discovering conclusively what had been the late Rebbe's will, because that would be determinative. So they had different sources. Aaron's Hasidim claimed that they had that 1996 declaration that Aaron would succeed him. For Zalman's Hasidim, however, they had a letter that was written in 2002 that declared Zalman as the successor. For the newspaper, Der Yid, which was actually owned by one of the Gaboyim of Moshe, so this is a Zali, there was no doubt who the new Rebbe was going to be. And Der Yid was the newspaper, it was the organ of the Satmar Hasidim. On the front page, there was a banner headline that said that Moshe Teitelbaum had passed away. And then it says in a smaller print underneath, and his son, Zalman Leib, has been appointed as his successor. During the week of Shiva, Zalman mourned in Williamsburg with their mother, and Aaron sat Shiva in Kiryas Yoel. Chassidim came to each one of these sons with kvitlach, with petitions, pidyon money, as though each one was the Rebbe without any single doubt. Now, the first Shabbos after Moshe's death, when every Satmar looked to see who would lead the very first all-important Tish, both Aaron and Zalman led separate gatherings, both in Williamsburg. Each ignored the fact that the other was acting as if they were the only true Rebbe. Aaron, who was based in Kiryas Yoel, gathered his Hasidim together and set up a temporary tent in a school playground, while Zalman used the main headquarters of Satmar. Now, a lot of attention was paid to the fact that Zalman was fearing Tish in the same place that his father had, that his uncle had. So this was a place that was hallowed by successive generations of Satmar Rebbes. That had a lot of significance. Aaron was in a temporary tent. No matter how many people he gathered, the fact that he did not have a permanent structure in Williamsburg meant something. So not long thereafter, the Aronis marched into the Williamsburg synagogue with a platoon of bouncers from a nightclub. The bouncers began climbing onto the bima, onto the dais, and fistfights broke out. Hasidim were punched. It was not a pretty picture. But ultimately, the Aronis realized they lost Williamsburg. They were based in Kiryas Yoel. They were not based in Williamsburg. And as a result, they could not make use of the headquarters. So what do? They go around the block to just a couple streets away, and they build a new building within 14 days to match the Satmar headquarters. So they created a bastion, a foothold in Zali territory. As the future unfolded, the lines of the Satmar dispute hardened. Aharon sought to claim definitively what he considered to be his birthright as the oldest son. He demanded to be considered the only Satmar leader. Zalman, however, held on to the major Satmar institutions in Williamsburg and moved to assert his authority elsewhere. Neither brother was prepared to bow to the supremacy of the other. Votes were held in a variety of Satmar communities over who would be on the controlling boards of the communities and institutions. In some places, the Zalis won, in other places, the Aronis won. At stake was considerable real estate, assets, property, things that were worth considerable money. The victory of one side led to the formation of the other of parallel competing institutions. This was an extremely expensive option, but with a battle beginning, both sides seemed fired up as they had not been in years. The success of any event was measured in numbers, often because that meant money. Most of the events were fundraisers. So the more successful a gathering was, the more funds would be collected. And so headlines would scream about the thousands who gathered with this Rebbe, or the great crowds that gathered with the other. Colossal successes were proclaimed with soul-raising experiences. And this is just sort of me waxing perhaps as a bit of an armchair sociologist. And we'll conclude with this. In the evolution of a highly conservative Hasidic world, insiders increasingly find little room for variation, meaning that there are not many options for the behaviors that are tolerated within the community. People dress the same. They live within the boundaries of their Hasidic enclave. They're educated in essentially the same ways and generally adhere to a one-size-fits-all principle of social and cultural uniformity. But the conflict here between the Aronis and the Zalis gave Satmar Hasidim an opportunity to differentiate themselves. Now, to be sure, as one commentator put it, the theological differences between the brothers are as thin as a page of Gemara, but the narcissism of small differences make the strengths of one brother and the weaknesses of the other loom large. This invigorated the group. It provided an opportunity for them to wage a battle, and it also provided perhaps an opportunity for many to differentiate themselves from others. With that, I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm open now for questions, comments, or rebuttals. All right, go ahead.
Just a couple of points of interest, Rabbi. Could you put the map back up?
Yeah, just a section. Just a second. Let me figure out how to do that from here. Okay. Okay. Do I have to? Okay. Do I have to move this back here? Okay, here. Share.
Yeah, sure.
Here's this. Share.
Yeah, just that last map that you had up.
Okay, just while I'm doing that, Eugene is asking a question. What's the connection? They view themselves as inspired by the Satmar Rebbe. I'm not sure if there's an official union. I know that the Satmar Rebbe is considered the president of the Eda HaCharedis in Israel, which the Neturei Karta is sort of an offshoot from. It's an extremist group within the Eda HaCharedis. They were actually kicked out of the Eda HaCharedis, but it's being too extreme. But yeah, okay. So here, Mel, you have the map in front of you.
Yeah. So if you see that the town of Satmar, Satumara.
Yeah, right over here.
The town just to the left of it is where Nyereg Haja. That's where Aggie Romer Siegel is from Nyereg Haja.
Aha. Okay, very cool. That's this place right over here.
Yeah, that town there. And also to note that Eli Wiesel was born in the town of Seget.
Yeah, that's this over here, right here.
He was from Seget. And the person that I used to sit beside in shul with Jacob Rennert and Oscar, Michael Wise, he was from the town of Irshava.
That's this.
It's on the border of Romania, the town that you were talking about. You pronounce it differently, Irshava. It's on the Romanian border. It's up by Mukachev.
Here, this one here?
No, it's north of Satmar.
This one here?
Yeah, right around there.
Okay. Okay, that's this one here. Okay.
And a cousin of mine wrote a book, and one thing I remembered in her book was you had mentioned that Yoel Teitelbaum was against immigration, and during when the winds of war were blowing in the 30s, many people. Yoel Teitelbaum was telling everybody that things will blow over. Stay where you are. Stay where you are. Don't leave. Stay where you are. Don't leave.
Yeah, I alluded to that. I said that he wasn't focused on telling people to leave. He was mostly focused on banning theaters and literature.
That's right. So he had some negative reviews on that account.
Yeah. No, people didn't know what was coming. Nobody could imagine that the Holocaust was about to transpire.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyways,
that's all I wanted to note.
It's really difficult to blame someone for that.
Sure.
Rabbi, are they still overwhelmingly anti-Zionist?
Yes. Yes. Without a doubt.
Regardless of which group they're in.
Regardless of the group.
They're pro-Iranian. They're kind of embarrassing, actually.
Well, no, Neturei Karta, it's not the same thing as Satmar. Satmar wouldn't go to Iran, but the Neturei Karta would. And the Neturei Karta view themselves as following in the footsteps of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. All right. Well, Yasher Kodesh, everyone. I will conclude.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Conclude the meeting, and have a great rest of your evening.
Yasher Kodesh, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very well.